We're joined here at Flow FM by Brad Perry from Grain Producers SA. Brad, how's it going off the back of a massive harvest?
Yeah, good, thanks, Ricky.
Now we get on with some of the other work that I'm sure you had to sort of keep in the background when it comes to things like the fire harvesting code for Grain Producers SA. That never stops for your organisation.
There's always plenty to do, Ricky.
And when it comes to, I guess, the lessons learned from the harvest, there's some conversation now about getting some of the grain off the roads and onto rail on the Eyre Peninsula. You've seen some comments that I'll share elsewhere from Tom Koutsantonis, the Transport Minister. He seems to be sort of blaming Viterra for closing down the network in the first place, even though now they want to open parts of it up again.
Oh, look, I think this conversation's been going on behind the scenes for a little while now. And largely, I think it's a conversation that needs to be had between some of those, commercial private interests, state and federal government on whether the rails is viable. I mean, from a grain producer's point of view, we see movement of grain from farm needs to be effective and efficient. I mean, I think that's the core of our position. As long as we're taking the most effective and efficient network to market, then we will support whatever that option is.
Well, I do notice that Minister Koutsantonis says they are generally supportive as a state government of new rail infrastructure, but would need to look at a proposal like this one about reopening lines out to as far as Woodner and making an assessment on the merits, including the degree of private investment involved. They seem a bit sheepish about putting government money into supporting something like this, but when it came to, say, green hydrogen, they're happy to run a public-funded utility.
Well, I think what Minister Koutsantonis is saying is probably spot on, really. They do need to see a full business case before they can even consider next steps. So, look, I think that's going to take some time and take a little bit of work behind the scenes. But we have seen a lot of money invested federally in other states into rail, whereas South Australia's largely missed out on that. So I think there's some consideration from that aspect from some of the commercial entities involved. But also we do know that the roads are seriously deteriorating. Grain Producers SA had the worst grain road campaign, and we highlighted some of the roads that our grain producers use, and they're literally falling apart. We were up at the Upper York Road, Atherton to Kalpara, which was our number one worst grain road in South Australia, and that road is just terrible. You can literally stop. The thin side, it's just falling away. You can barely fit one truck onto that road. So it shows the state of our roads, and I think if it's viable and not a cost to growers at the back end, then look, I think it is an option to try and get rail back into the system.
Now, I note we are in a cycle at the moment in politics where we're approaching the state and federal budgets. Is there something that Grain Producers SA have said to either the state or federal government you're really hoping that might be what might be a focal point for them in terms of improving freight and infrastructure?
Oh, I think it's an ongoing conversation, Ricky. So it's about advocating on which roads we think need to see upgrades, and that's what the worst grain road report's done. So we've highlighted that to relevant ministers, federal and state, and local government as well. The rail conversation, I think, is going to happen for some time, and we need to really make sure that it is viable. I mean, that's the end option. We don't want to see what's happened previously. We don't want to see that happening again.
What with the shutdown of the network, you mean, in 2019?
That's right. Yeah, the lines were just so deteriorated that it just became inefficient. So if there's going to be a model that supports rail, it's got to be viable financially.
And I guess maybe the people's thoughts on this might have changed after the last few years you've had on the Eyre Peninsula in particular, where there's a significant amount that's come off the paddocks. Maybe they were thinking some of the narrative about climate change and the weather systems moving further south might be turned on its head, and maybe thinking we will be producing a lot out of these areas in future.
Oh, I think we can't get too ahead of ourselves, Ricky. It's really weather dependent, so we often see a couple of good seasons of rain, and we know that the outlook at the moment currently is for some drier to come and less rain. So we've probably got to we do have to be careful in that regard, and we should know too that I don't think rail stacks up on just grain movement alone. So there'd have to be another commodity or several commodities that are utilising that as well to make it viable, I imagine. So, look, I think there's a lot of work to do. But if it's viable and it's efficient, then and it's not a cost to the grower, then we are happy to certainly look at that.
Well, the other commodity you mentioned there, could well be mineral resources. I know there was the one up around Warramboo and the railway line talk there with the Chinese consortium. I mean, is that where we possibly have to find some way of meeting in the middle with the mining industry to make rail viable?
Yeah, I think it's got to be more than one commodity. There's no doubt about that. So we've seen rail that's been used across South Australia in the past has done that. So I imagine that it's got to be a multi-pronged approach if rail is going to be viable at all into the future.
All right, Brad Perry is the CEO of Grain Producers SA. Thanks so much for sharing some of your time with us today.
No worries, Ricky. I look forward to watching this space.